It was a Friday night, and for the first time, Sarah was left home alone. Her parents had gone out of town for a weekend getaway, trusting their 17-year-old daughter to manage just fine. It wasn't unusual. She was independent, responsible, and had always been mature for her age. The storm outside had been brewing all day, but it was the kind of rain Sarah liked, heavy, rhythmic, the kind that made staying indoors feel cozy and safe. The house was an old 2-story Victorian-style home, the kind that creaked with every gust of wind, adding a certain charm to its eerie atmosphere. It had been in the family for generations, full of old stories and long-forgotten secrets. As the rain drummed against the windows, Sarah settled into her favorite spot on the living room couch, a bowl of popcorn beside her and her laptop open, ready for a night of binge-watching horror movies. It was almost a ritual, watching horror movies on nights like this, where the real world outside felt just creepy enough to make the jump scares more effective. She had just started the second movie when a loud asterisk thump asterisk echoed from upstairs. The sound startled her, causing her to spill popcorn on the floor. Sarah paused the movie, her heart pounding, trying to convince herself it was just the house settling or a branch hitting the roof. The house was old, after all, prone to all sorts of creaks and groans. She waited a few moments, ears straining for any further sound. Nothing. "Get a grip, Sarah," she whispered to herself with a nervous chuckle, picking up the spilled popcorn. She pressed play again, trying to lose herself in the movie. 15 minutes passed, and the rain intensified, sheets of water slashing against the windows. Lightning illuminated the room for a split second, and in that moment, Sarah thought she saw something, a figure maybe, standing outside in the yard. Her breath caught in her throat, but when the light faded, nothing was there. She leaned toward the window, squinting into the darkness, but all she could see was the rain pouring down. "Just your imagination," she muttered. Another asterisk thump asterisk came from upstairs, louder this time. The popcorn bowl slipped from her hands entirely, scattering across the floor. Sarah stood up, her heart racing. That wasn't just the house settling. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. Sarah grabbed it quickly, hoping it was a text from her parents. Instead, there was an unknown number on the screen. The message simply read, "I'm outside, asterisk asterisk." Her blood ran cold. For a moment, she stared at the message, her brain refusing to comprehend it. Who would send that? Was this some kind of sick joke? A prank? Before she could react, another message buzzed in. "I'm coming inside now, asterisk asterisk." Sarah's breath hitched. She immediately dialed 911, her hands shaking as she pressed the numbers. The call rang once, twice, and then cut off. She looked at the phone in horror. It had no signal. That was impossible. She always had signal here. Panic set in. She turned off all the lights, trying to hide in the darkness. Her mind raced. Was the door locked? Did she check the windows? Her parents had always reminded her to double-check everything, but in her rush to watch movies, she might have forgotten. She heard the back door creak. Every hair on her body stood on end. Sarah grabbed a kitchen knife and crept toward the sound, her footsteps as silent as possible on the wooden floor. The sound of the rain seemed deafening now, drowning out everything but her own pounding heartbeat. She could hear soft, slow footsteps, barely discernible, but they were there, moving through the house. Trembling, Sarah crouched behind the kitchen counter, trying to steady her breathing. She peeked around the edge, her knife clutched so tightly her knuckles turned white. From her vantage point, she could just make out the silhouette of a tall figure standing in the hallway. The rain-soaked stranger was dripping wet, his long coat clinging to his body as he moved slowly through the house, his head turning as though he was searching for something or someone. Sarah's mind raced. How had he gotten inside? Was the door really unlocked? Suddenly the figure stopped, his head tilting slightly. He stood there, perfectly still, like he was listening for something. Sarah held her breath, afraid that even the sound of her breathing would give her away. She could hear the drip, drip, drip of water falling from his coat onto the hardwood floor. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, he turned his head and looked directly at the spot where Sarah was hiding. Her heart nearly stopped. She ducked behind the counter, trying to stifle a gasp. The sound of footsteps came closer, the wet thud of boots against the floor growing louder with each step. She knew she had to do something, but her body felt frozen in place. The footsteps stopped, just inches from her hiding spot. Sarah gripped the knife tighter, every muscle in her body tensing, ready to defend herself. Suddenly, the front door flew open with a loud bang, wind and rain gusting into the house. The figure paused, then turned slowly and walked toward the open door, disappearing into the storm without a word. For what felt like an eternity, Sarah sat there, shaking, trying to process what had just happened. Her heart was still racing, her body drenched in cold sweat. She didn't know whether to follow him, call someone, or stay hidden. Just as she was about to stand up, her phone buzzed again. With trembling hands, she picked it up and looked at the screen. Another message from the unknown number. "I'll be back." The next day, the police arrived after Sarah's frantic call from a neighbor's landline. They checked the house, but there were no signs of forced entry, no footprints outside in the mud, no evidence that anyone had even been there. The police told her it was probably just a prank, some teenage boy trying to scare her, but Sarah knew better. That night wasn't a prank, and every time it rained, she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, out in the storm, he was still watching, waiting for the next time she was alone. It was supposed to be a fun night, a simple sleepover. Emma and Lily, both 16, were best friends since childhood, practically inseparable. Lily's parents were out of town for the weekend, so they had the house to themselves. They had plans for junk food, horror movies, and staying up late talking about school crushes and life plans. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that would prepare them for the night ahead. Lily's house was large, an older home on the outskirts of their small town. It had been in the family for years, with a sprawling basement that was rarely used, except for storage. The basement was always a little creepy, but they avoided it whenever possible. No need to go down there tonight, they thought. Outside, the wind howled and a light rain had started to fall, a storm brewing on the horizon. They settled into the living room with a blanket fort and a marathon of horror movies on TV. It was the perfect setup, the kind of night that felt safe and comforting, despite the creepy movies they were watching. The storm outside just added to the atmosphere. As the first movie ended, Emma got up to grab more snacks from the kitchen while Lily stayed under the blankets. Emma made her way through the darkened house, the only light coming from the flickering glow of the TV in the other room. The kitchen was cold, a draft from the window making her shiver. Suddenly, she heard a faint noise, a creak. It came from the basement door. Emma stopped, her hand hovering over the snack cabinet. The basement? She strained to hear, but all she could make out was the wind outside. She told herself it was just the house settling, maybe a draft. Still, her heart quickened as she grabbed the snacks and hurried back to the living room. "Did you hear that?" she asked, sitting down next to Lily. Lily raised an eyebrow, barely glancing away from the TV. "Hear what?" "A creak. I think it came from the basement." Lily laughed. "It's just the wind. This house always makes weird noises when it storms." Emma tried to shake off the unease. She nodded and let the movie pull her back in, though her mind wandered. The basement. She hadn't even thought about it in years, but something about tonight, with the rain and the empty house, made it feel closer. About an hour later, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, the only sound the heavy patter of rain against the windows and the gusts of wind howling through the trees. "Great," Lily groaned, fumbling for her phone to turn on the flashlight. "Storm must have knocked something out. I'll go grab some candles." Emma stayed on the couch, her phone light not doing much to chase away the darkness. A knot of anxiety settled in her stomach as she listened to Lily's footsteps move through the house. She felt uneasy, like the house was too quiet now, like something was waiting just out of sight. She heard another sound, a slow creaking noise, almost like footsteps, but this time it wasn't from the floor above. It was coming from below, the basement. Her breath hitched in her throat. She stared at the closed basement door, her heart pounding. It was subtle, but she could hear it. Footsteps. Soft, slow, like someone, or something, was down there, moving quietly, trying not to be heard. Emma stood up just as Lily returned with a candle. "Got it," she said, lighting the wick and setting it on the coffee table. "Should be enough light for now." Emma pointed toward the basement door, her voice barely a whisper. "I heard something down there." Lily rolled her eyes. "Emma, come on, you're getting paranoid. It's an old house." "No." Emma's voice was firm now. "I'm serious. I heard footsteps." Lily's expression shifted from amusement to concern. She followed Emma's gaze to the basement door. "You're sure?" Emma nodded. "I think someone's down there." They stood in silence for a moment, staring at the door. The house was still, except for the faint sound of rain hitting the windows and the occasional rumble of thunder in the distance. Neither of them moved. Then they heard it again, a soft thump from the basement. Lily swallowed hard, her bravado fading. "Okay, that wasn't the wind." "What if someone's in the house?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. Lily grabbed her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed 911. The call rang twice, then went straight to voicemail. She tried again, but the same thing happened. No signal. "Seriously?" she muttered, staring at her phone in disbelief. "We always have signal here." Panic started to set in. Emma grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter, her mind racing. "What do we do?" Lily stared at the basement door, her heart pounding in her chest. "We need to check." "Are you crazy?" Emma hissed. "We should just leave. What if it's just something weird, like a raccoon or something?" Emma's face paled. "Footsteps aren't raccoons, Lily." but Lily was already making her way toward the basement door, her phone's flashlight trembling in her hand. She took a deep breath and slowly turned the knob, the door creaking open with a groan. The dark, narrow staircase descended into the basement, the air cold and damp. "Stay here," Lily whispered. "I'm not staying up here alone," Emma whispered back, gripping the knife tightly. The two girls descended the stairs, the old wooden steps creaking beneath their weight. The basement smelled musty, the faint scent of mildew hanging in the air. The weak light from Lily's phone barely cut through the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. The basement was cluttered with old boxes and furniture covered in dusty sheets. Everything seemed still, too still. They reached the bottom of the stairs, and for a moment nothing happened. Emma's heart pounded so loudly in her ears she thought it might burst. She was about to suggest they go back upstairs when Lily's light caught something. A figure, half hidden behind an old wardrobe. A man. He stood perfectly still, watching them, his face obscured by the shadows. His clothes were disheveled, dirty, and his eyes glinted in the faint light. Emma gasped, stumbling back, her knife raised. Lily froze in place, her phone shaking as she aimed the light at him. "Who are you?" Lily demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer. He just smiled, slowly. That smile wasn't right. It stretched too wide, too long, like something out of a nightmare. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on. The basement was flooded with harsh fluorescent light, and in that instant, the man was gone. There was no trace of him, no footprints, no sign he had ever been there at all. But both girls had seen him, they knew, and every time they looked at the basement door from that night forward, they knew he was still there, watching, waiting. Henry lived alone in a small, weathered house on the outskirts of town. He was in his late 70s, and after losing his wife a few years back, the loneliness crept in like the shadows that crawled across his walls at night. His children had long since moved away, only visiting occasionally, leaving Henry with his old routines and the quiet hum of the radio for company. The house had always been a bit creaky, but lately, the sounds had grown stranger. The wood groaned with age, and the pipes clattered during the night. Still, Henry chalked it up to the house settling, the wind rattling the old windows, or maybe even his mind playing tricks on him. After all, the isolation had a way of messing with your senses when there was no one around to talk to. One particular night, a heavy storm brewed outside, the kind that made you want to stay under the blankets with a hot cup of tea. The rain pelted against the windows, and the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. A relentless sound that reminded Henry how alone he truly was. Around midnight, just as he was drifting into a fitful sleep, Henry heard a sound that was far too deliberate to be the wind or the house settling. Knock, knock, knock. It was faint but distinct, a knocking on the front door. Henry sat up in bed, his heart picking up pace. Who would be knocking at this hour, especially in this storm? He grabbed his old robe and shuffled toward the door, the wooden floor creaking beneath his slippers. As he reached the front room, he paused, listening closely. The rain was coming down in sheets now, but the knocking persisted. 3 slow, deliberate taps. He felt a strange chill crawl up his spine. It wasn't the sound itself that unnerved him, but the time of night and the storm raging outside. Who could be out there in weather like this? Henry approached the door and peered through the peephole, expecting to see a stranded neighbor, a lost traveler, or maybe even a delivery gone wrong. But there was no one. His breath fogged up the small glass window as he pressed his face closer, scanning the porch and the yard beyond. The wind blew leaves and debris across the lawn, but not a soul stood there. He stood there for a moment, hand hovering over the doorknob, debating whether to open it, but his instincts screamed at him to leave it locked. Knock, knock, knock. This time, the sound wasn't from the door. It was coming from the back of the house. Henry's heart raced. How could someone have moved to the back so quickly? The knocking was just as slow and deliberate as before, but now it was coming from the rear entrance. There was no way someone could have run from the front door to the back without him hearing them or seeing them. Torn between investigating and hiding, Henry decided to check. He moved toward the kitchen, where the back door was, his hands trembling. As he reached for the light switch, he hesitated. Something told him not to turn it on. Instead, he peered through the dark window above the kitchen sink, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever, or whatever, was knocking. But once again, there was no one there. The storm raged on, but the yard was empty. Henry stared at the door for a moment longer, his thoughts racing. Was this some kind of prank? Kids playing a cruel joke? Or was it something else? Just as he was about to turn away, the knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't just on the door. It was on the walls, the windows, everywhere. The sound surrounded the house, coming from every side. Knock, knock, Knock. Henry backed away, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind spinning with confusion and fear. How was this happening? He couldn't make sense of it. No one was out there, but the knocking wouldn't stop. Knock, knock, knock. It grew louder, echoing through the house, as if 100 hands were pounding on every surface. Henry stumbled back into the living room, feeling like he was losing his grip on reality. The walls seemed to vibrate with the noise, the storm outside intensifying, but through it all, the knocking was constant, relentless. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. The rain still beat against the windows, the wind still howled, but the knocking had ceased. Henry stood frozen in the center of the room, listening for any sign of movement. For what felt like an eternity, the house was still, save for the occasional groan of old wood. He let out a shaky breath and made his way to his armchair, sinking into it, his hands trembling. His mind raced, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe it was just the storm. Maybe the wind had knocked something against the house. Maybe... Knock, knock, knock. Henry shot up, his breath catching in his throat. This time the sound wasn't coming from the doors or the windows. It was coming from the walls. His heart raced as he listened, his eyes wide with terror. The knocking was coming from inside the walls, as if someone or something was trapped inside, trying to get out. He backed away from the chair, his knees weak, his mind screaming at him to leave the house. But before he could move, he heard something else. A voice, faint but unmistakable. It whispered from the walls, "Let me in." Henry's blood ran cold. The voice was soft, almost pleading, but there was something unnatural about it, something that made his skin crawl. He shook his head, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination, a trick of the storm and the isolation. But the voice came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Let me in." The walls seemed to vibrate with the sound, the knocking growing louder once again, in sync with the voice. Knock, knock, knock. Henry stumbled toward the door, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the locks. He needed to get out, now, but before he could turn the knob, the door shook violently, as if someone was pounding on the other side with all their might. Knock, knock, knock. "Let me in." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a command, deep and unnatural, echoing through the house, vibrating the very walls. Henry's hand slipped from the doorknob as he staggered back, his legs giving out beneath him. "Let me in." The pounding became deafening, the entire house shaking now, as if it were going to collapse under the weight of the sound. The voice boomed, filling every corner of the room, every inch of his mind. "Let me in." With a final desperate gasp, Henry screamed, his voice lost in the cacophony of the storm, the knocking, and the voice that seemed to come from every direction at once. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped.